A racist waiter sees a black woman at a fancy restaurant and gives her terrible service on purpose. But what he doesn't know is that the black woman is the owner's wife. Camille Johnson stepped through the doors of Bistro Nouveau, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floors. The restaurant was alive with the quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of wine glasses, and the soft music playing in the background. The dim lighting gave the place an intimate, upscale atmosphere, one that Camille had always appreciated. Tonight, though, she couldn't shake the slight unease that settled in her stomach. She'd arrived earlier than Matthew, her husband, who was wrapping up a meeting across town. He had insisted she go ahead and order without him. But now, sitting alone at a corner table, she wasn't sure if that had been the best idea. She glanced around at the well-dressed patrons scattered across the restaurant. Their laughter and chatter filled the air, blending seamlessly with the soft jazz playing from the speakers. As she adjusted her chair, a waiter appeared at her side. He was tall, blonde, and wore the restaurant's black and white uniform. His name tag read Ethan. He didn't smile or greet her warmly like the waitstaff at Bistro Nouveau usually did. Instead, he barely made eye contact. "You ready to order?" Ethan asked, his tone flat. Camille blinked, a little taken aback by his abruptness. She glanced at the empty table in front of her. "Could I just get some water for now? I'll order in a bit." Ethan scribbled something down, his expression still unreadable. "Sure." He turned and walked away without another word. Camille watched him as he moved swiftly to another table across the room. The couple seated there, a middle-aged pair with designer clothes and bright smiles, were greeted with a warm laugh and a quick refill of their wine glasses. Ethan chatted with them for a moment before moving on to another table, his demeanor completely different from the one he had just shown her. Camille shook her head slightly, trying to brush off the feeling that something was off. Maybe he was just having a bad day, but as she sat there, waiting for her water, her unease deepened. Minutes ticked by. She watched Ethan make his rounds to other tables, always stopping to check on the diners, offering smiles and polite conversation. Yet, he hadn't returned to her table once. She had come here dozens of times with Matthew, and the service was always impeccable. But tonight, alone, it felt different. She tried not to overthink it. Her phone buzzed with a message from Matthew. "Running a little late, babe. Order whatever you like. Be there soon." Camille typed a quick reply and put her phone down, glancing up to see Ethan attending to a large group by the window. Her glass of water still hadn't arrived. She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched him. He laughed again with the group, pouring wine and placing dishes in front of them. Not once had he looked her way. 5 more minutes passed and still, no water. Camille shifted in her seat, her earlier unease slowly transforming into frustration. Something wasn't right. She glanced around the restaurant again, noticing the effortless flow of service for everyone else but her. A knot of tension settled in her chest. She flagged down another waitress walking by, a young woman named Sarah, who always seemed polite whenever she had served them before. "Excuse me," Camille said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been waiting for some water for a while now." "Could you bring me a glass, please?" Sarah blinked in surprise, her expression immediately apologetic. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I'll bring it right away." She hurried off toward the bar. As Camille waited, she felt the weight of other patrons' eyes briefly glancing her way, before returning to their own conversations. The knot of tension tightened. It wasn't about the water. It was something else, something she had seen too many times before. Still, she pushed the thought aside, waiting for the service she knew she deserved. When Sarah returned with her water, Camille thanked her quietly, watching as Ethan continued to float between tables, all the while pretending she didn't exist. She took a sip of the cold water, feeling the ice clink against the glass, but the taste did little to cool her rising frustration. Whatever was going on tonight, it was more than just a bad day for a waiter. Camille took another sip of water, her eyes fixed on Ethan as he moved around the restaurant with an ease and grace that had not been extended to her. He glided from table to table, pouring wine, refilling glasses, and engaging in light banter with the other diners. His smile was always warm and welcoming, except when it came to her. She couldn't help but notice how attentive he was to every table but hers. The more she watched, the more her earlier unease solidified into something heavier. This wasn't just about the slow service or the lack of attention. It felt deliberate. Her fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the glass as she contemplated her next move. Should she say something? Was she overreacting? She had been in enough situations like this to know the familiar doubt creeping in. Camille had learned to pick her battles, but tonight, the blatant difference in treatment gnawed at her. 20 more minutes passed, and still, Ethan hadn't returned to take her order. The restaurant was getting busier, but that didn't excuse the fact that he had completely avoided her table. At a nearby table, a new group had arrived, and within moments, Ethan was there, taking their orders with the same charm and energy he had shown everyone but her. Camille straightened in her chair and raised her hand slightly, trying to catch his attention. Ethan's eyes flitted past her, making no acknowledgement. He turned his back and headed toward the kitchen. Camille's lips pressed into a thin line, her patience wearing thin. She glanced at her phone, wondering how much longer Matthew would be. Her stomach growled, a reminder that she had yet to even order, let alone eat. Camille took a deep breath and decided to flag Ethan down the next time he passed. She was done sitting quietly and being ignored. As soon as he reappeared from the kitchen, she raised her hand again. This time, there was no way he could miss her. "Excuse me?" she called out, her voice louder than before, her tone firm. Ethan paused, turning toward her with a blank expression. He approached her table, and for a brief moment, Camille thought she might be overthinking the whole situation. Maybe he just hadn't noticed her before. But the look in his eyes as he neared her made her second-guess that hope. "What can I get you?" he asked flatly. No trace of the enthusiasm or warmth he had shown to every other table. Camille blinked, her frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "I'd like to place my order, please. I've been waiting for quite some time." Ethan shrugged slightly. "We've been busy." Camille's eyebrows lifted, her frustration quickly turning into disbelief. She glanced around the restaurant again, watching how effortlessly Ethan moved between the other tables, never missing a beat. Busy? Sure, but not too busy for everyone else. She kept her tone measured, not wanting to escalate things too quickly. "I've noticed you've been able to attend to the other tables without any issue. Is there a reason I've been sitting here for nearly 30 minutes without even having my order taken?" Ethan shifted on his feet, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Maybe you're just being sensitive." Camille's grip on her glass tightened, but she kept her composure. She had heard variations of this line before, accusations that her experiences were imagined, that her feelings were invalid. She wasn't about to let this slide. "Sensitive?" she repeated, her voice low but sharp. "I'm asking for the same service you're providing to every other customer in here. I don't think that's being sensitive. I think that's asking for basic respect." Ethan sighed, as if she were wasting his time. "Look, we're short-staffed and there's a lot going on. I'll take your order, but if you're going to accuse me of—" "I'm not accusing you of anything," Camille interrupted, her voice steady. "I'm simply pointing out the difference in how you're treating me compared to everyone else in this restaurant. And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." Ethan's expression hardened, his mouth pulling into a thin line. He said nothing for a moment, then pulled out his notepad. "What do you want to order?" he asked, the coldness in his voice unmistakable. Camille held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I'll have the house special," she said, her tone matching his. Ethan scribbled something on his notepad and walked away without another word. Camille watched him go, her frustration now mixed with a deep sense of indignation. She had seen this behavior before, this subtle, almost invisible discrimination that so many tried to pretend didn't exist. But tonight, it was right in front of her, undeniable and infuriating. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly as she tried to calm herself. Her fingers tapped against her phone, resisting the urge to text Matthew. He'd be here soon enough. But even as she tried to focus on the food that was finally, hopefully, on its way, Camille couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse. This wasn't over. Camille sat in silence, her frustration simmering as the minutes ticked by. Ethan hadn't returned since taking her order, and though the restaurant bustled around her, she felt like she was in a bubble, ignored, overlooked, and isolated in a place that should have made her feel welcome. She glanced at her watch. It had been nearly 45 minutes since Ethan had scribbled down her order. Still no food, no updates, and no sign of him. The soft clinking of plates and murmured conversations filled the air. Nearby tables continued to be showered with attention, as servers brought out dish after dish, drinks constantly refilled. A sense of disbelief washed over her. How could someone in a place like this, where service was supposed to be impeccable, get away with this kind of behavior? Her patience had officially run out. She flagged down Sarah, the waitress who had brought her water earlier. Sarah approached quickly, a concerned look on her face. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with genuine concern. Camille sighed, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing anger. "I've been waiting over an hour now. I ordered the house special, and I still haven't received any food. Can you check with the kitchen for me, please?" Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, I'm so sorry. That's definitely not normal. Let me see what's going on." Sarah rushed off toward the kitchen, leaving Camille to stew in her frustration. She clenched her jaw, watching as other tables received their meals with no issues, all while she sat there, forgotten. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, but underneath that, a deeper feeling started to bubble up. Something closer to anger. This wasn't just bad service. This was intentional. A few minutes later, Sarah returned, looking flustered and apologetic. I checked with the kitchen, she began, nervously clutching the tray she was holding, and they said they never received your order. Camille's eyes widened in disbelief. What? How is that possible? Ethan took my order almost an hour ago. Sarah bit her lip, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. I'm really sorry, ma'am. It looks like he never put it in. Camille's pulse quickened, her frustration now bubbling into full-blown anger. She stared past Sarah toward the kitchen doors where Ethan had disappeared after taking her order. He had deliberately neglected her, again. Camille stood up, her hands resting on the edge of the table. Can you please get Ethan to come over here? She asked, her voice calm, but with an edge sharp enough to cut through the tension. Sarah nodded quickly and hurried off, clearly eager to avoid further confrontation. Camille watched her go, feeling the eyes of other patrons briefly flick in her direction, before turning back to their meals. She knew the looks. They were the kind that appeared when something uncomfortable was happening, but no one wanted to get involved. A minute later, Ethan appeared, walking slowly toward her table, his expression as unreadable as ever. He approached with a slight swagger, as if nothing were wrong at all. That was what infuriated her the most. The nonchalance, the audacity of his attitude. Is there a problem? He asked, his voice completely devoid of any genuine concern. Camille stared at him for a long moment, gathering herself. She didn't want to explode, not yet, but she was done being polite. Yes, there's a problem. You never put my order in. Ethan blinked, his face remaining expressionless. I'm sure that's just a misunderstanding. Camille's eyes narrowed. A misunderstanding. I've been sitting here for over an hour. You took my order, and now I find out you never even bothered to put it in. How is that a misunderstanding? Ethan shrugged, and Camille felt a surge of anger at his indifference. Look, we're busy tonight. Mistakes happen. Camille's temper flared. It wasn't a mistake. You've ignored me from the moment I walked in. You've given every other table exceptional service, but you can't even be bothered to give me the basic courtesy of taking my order. And now you're telling me it's just a mistake? Ethan's eyes darkened, a flicker of something more dangerous crossing his face. He crossed his arms over his chest, his posture defensive. If you're going to start accusing me of things, maybe you should just leave. Camille's breath caught, her anger now boiling over. Accusing you? I'm pointing out exactly what's been happening all night. You've ignored me, treated me like I don't exist, while bending over backward for everyone else. This isn't about a mistake. This is about you thinking you can get away with treating me like this because I'm a black woman sitting alone in this restaurant. The words hung in the air between them, sharp and heavy. The nearby tables had gone quiet, and Camille could feel the weight of the other diners' eyes on her. But she didn't care. She wasn't going to let him brush this off. Not when it was so obvious what was really happening. Ethan's face flushed red, and he shifted uncomfortably. I'm not going to stand here and let you accuse me of being a racist, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. If you don't like the service, maybe you should leave. Camille's fists clenched at her sides, her heart pounding. I'm not going anywhere, she said firmly. I'm paying to be here just like everyone else. You're not kicking me out because you don't like being called out on your behavior. Just as Ethan opened his mouth to respond, the restaurant doors swung open, and Camille's eyes shifted toward the entrance. Matthew strode in, his tall figure cutting a commanding presence as he made his way toward their table. Camille's breath caught, and for the first time that night, a sense of relief washed over her. Ethan's face paled when he saw Matthew approaching, and his posture changed instantly. He stood a little straighter, his eyes flicking nervously between Camille and her husband, as if suddenly realizing just how badly he had messed up. Matthew reached their table, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp as they locked onto Ethan. What's going on here? He asked, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable authority. Camille remained silent for a moment, letting Ethan squirm under Matthew's gaze. She could already see the fear creeping into his expression. He didn't know who Matthew was. At least not yet. Your waiter here, Camille said slowly, has been ignoring me all night, never put in my order, and is now trying to kick me out because I called him out on his behavior. Matthew's eyes didn't leave Ethan. Is that so? Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face was ashen now, his earlier bravado completely gone. He finally seemed to realize who Matthew was, and Camille could practically see the gears turning in his head, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation, but it was already too late. Ethan stood frozen in place, his face pale as he stared up at Matthew. The confidence and smug attitude he had displayed earlier evaporated in an instant. Camille sat back in her chair, watching the shift in power play out right before her eyes. She didn't need to say anything more. Ethan had just realized who he was dealing with, and there was no way out for him now. Matthew's gaze remained steady, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. He crossed his arms, his presence radiating quiet authority, but his tone remained calm, measured. "So," Matthew said, his voice low but carrying across the now silent section of the restaurant, "you've been ignoring my wife, have you?" Ethan stammered, his words stumbling over themselves. No, sir, I wasn't." He glanced nervously around the room, as if searching for someone to rescue him. But no one was coming to his aid. Every other diner had turned back to their own conversations, clearly eager to stay out of the unfolding drama. Matthew raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Ethan's growing panic. "It certainly sounds like you've been giving her a hard time," he continued, "ignoring her order, not providing basic service. And now, from what I just heard, you're trying to kick her out of my restaurant?" Ethan's face turned bright red, and he quickly shook his head. No, I didn't know, I didn't mean." "You didn't know she was my wife?" Matthew finished for him, his voice sharp. Ethan swallowed hard, clearly trying to regain some control over the situation. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know she was—" "Why should it matter who she is?" Matthew cut him off, his voice colder now, the edge of his frustration slipping through. "Do you treat all of your customers this way? Or just the ones you think you can get away with disrespecting?" Camille stayed silent, letting Matthew handle the confrontation. She could see the fear in Ethan's eyes now, his mind racing as he tried to find a way out of the situation. But there was no escape. He had made his choices, and now he was going to face the consequences. I'm really sorry, sir. It wasn't like that, I promise. It was just a mistake. Things got busy, and Ethan's words tumbled out, desperate and unconvincing. Matthew's eyes narrowed. "Busy?" he said, his voice steady but firm. "You had plenty of time to attend to everyone else, didn't you? So what was the real issue here?" Ethan's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stood there fumbling for a response, knowing full well that anything he said would only dig him deeper into the hole he had already dug for himself. Camille spoke up, her voice calm but sharp. "It's not just about the service. You made a choice to ignore me, to treat me as less than every other customer here tonight. And when I called you out on it, you tried to turn it around and make it seem like I was the problem." Ethan's eyes flickered toward her, but he quickly looked away, unable to meet her gaze. His entire demeanor had shifted from smug arrogance to silent panic. Matthew uncrossed his arms and took a step closer to Ethan, who visibly flinched. "Here's what's going to happen," Matthew said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "You're going to go home for the night. We'll deal with this tomorrow. But understand one thing. There's no place for this kind of behavior in my restaurant." Ethan nodded quickly, his face pale. "Yes, sir," he muttered, barely able to form the words. "Now go," Matthew ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He turned and practically fled toward the back of the restaurant, disappearing through the kitchen doors without a second glance. The tension in the air lingered, though the worst of it had passed. Slowly, the noise of the restaurant resumed, as the patrons who had been eavesdropping returned to their meals and conversations, pretending they hadn't just witnessed the entire scene. Matthew turned back to Camille, his expression softening. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, reaching for her hand across the table. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle now, the anger from moments before completely gone. Camille exhaled, feeling the weight of the night lift off her shoulders. She squeezed his hand in return. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was a little shaky. I couldn't believe how blatant he was." Matthew shook his head, his jaw tightening slightly. "Some people think they can get away with that kind of behavior. They forget that the world is changing." "I wasn't sure if I was going to say something at first," Camille admitted, her voice quiet. "But I knew I couldn't just let it slide." Matthew smiled softly, admiration in his eyes. "You did the right thing, and I'm glad you didn't let him push you around. No one should ever have to deal with that kind of disrespect." Camille nodded, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion wash over her. The confrontation had drained her more than she realized, but at the same time, she felt stronger for standing up for herself. Ethan's behavior had been appalling, but in the end, he was the one who had to face the consequences, not her. "Thank you for stepping in when you did," Camille said, her voice soft. "I wasn't sure how far he was going to take it." Matthew squeezed her hand again, his eyes warm. "I'll always have your back. You know that." The tension that had filled the night slowly began to fade as they sat together, the world around them continuing on as if nothing had happened. But Camille knew that what had transpired was important. A reminder that even in a place as seemingly polished and elegant as this restaurant, there were still those who carried their prejudices with them. whether they knew it or not. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Camille and Matthew shared a meal together, the earlier event still lingering in the back of their minds, but there was no more drama. The restaurant continued its usual rhythm, oblivious to the significance of what had just happened. But Camille knew, and so did Matthew. The real conversation, the real reckoning, was still to come. Tomorrow, they would face Ethan again, and this time, there would be no escape for him. The morning sun filtered gently through the blinds in Matthew's office, casting long shadows across the room. Camille sat in one of the leather chairs opposite Matthew's desk, her mind still replaying the events of the night before. Today wasn't just about seeking justice for herself, it was about setting a standard, ensuring that people like Ethan understood that their actions had consequences. Matthew sat behind his desk, his expression calm but serious. He flipped through a few documents, occasionally glancing up at Camille. "You sure you want to be here for this?" he asked, though he already knew her answer. "Absolutely," Camille replied firmly. "This isn't just about you or the restaurant. It's about the principal. He needs to hear it from both of us." Matthew nodded, understanding. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the street below, waiting. Camille could sense the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like the calm before a storm. A knock sounded at the door. Matthew turned, and with a deep breath he called out, "Come in." Ethan shuffled in, looking worlds away from the smug, arrogant waiter he'd been the night before. He avoided their eyes, his steps hesitant. Camille noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he sat down, his usual bravado replaced with nervous uncertainty. "Morning," Matthew said, his tone flat. Ethan swallowed and nodded, clearly anxious. "Morning, sir," he mumbled. Matthew didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need to talk about last night," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "You're aware of why you're here, right?" Ethan nodded quickly, his eyes darting between Camille and Matthew. "Yes, sir. I know. Good. Because this isn't just about bad service. What happened last night was unacceptable in more ways than one. Do you have anything you want to say before we start?" Ethan fidgeted in his seat, glancing at Camille but quickly looking away again. "I'm sorry for what happened, sir," he said quietly, though there was no conviction in his voice. "I didn't mean for it to come off like that." Matthew's eyes narrowed. "Come off like what, exactly?" Ethan fumbled with his words, his voice shaky. "I didn't mean to offend anyone. It wasn't personal. I was just busy and things got away from me. I didn't know she was, my wife?" Matthew finished the sentence, his voice harder now. Ethan nodded quickly, looking even more uncomfortable. "Yes, sir. If I'd known," Camille finally spoke up, her voice sharp and cutting. "If you'd known I was his wife, you would have treated me differently. Is that what you're saying?" Ethan froze, realizing too late what he had implied. His eyes widened, and he stammered, No, that's not what I meant. His words trailed off, unsure how to dig himself out of the hole he'd just created. Matthew leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him on the desk. "This isn't about whether or not you knew who she was. It's about how you treated her, and the fact that you thought you could get away with it because you assumed no one would care." Ethan's face flushed red. "I didn't mean—" "Stop," Matthew interrupted, his voice cold and final. "We're not here to listen to your excuses. You disrespected my wife and, by extension, this restaurant. You didn't just forget her order or make a mistake. You ignored her because you thought it didn't matter. But it does." Ethan fell silent, his head hanging low. Camille watched him, her frustration simmering just below the surface. She had no pity for him, not after the way he had treated her, but she wasn't done yet. "I want to hear the truth, Ethan," Camille said, her voice steady. "Why did you really act the way you did last night? What made you think it was okay to ignore me, to treat me like I didn't deserve the same respect as everyone else?" Ethan looked at her, his face pale. I wasn't trying to disrespect you. I didn't mean for it to seem that way." Camille raised an eyebrow. "Didn't mean for it to seem that way?" "Ethan, you didn't even take my order. You ignored me for over an hour while you attended to everyone else. You didn't even refill my water. How is that not intentional?" Ethan's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked at Matthew, hoping for a lifeline, but found none. Matthew remained silent, his expression stern. "We're giving you one chance to tell the truth," Camille said, her voice firm. "No more excuses." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he struggled to find his voice. He hesitated, then finally spoke, his words barely a whisper. "I didn't think you'd cause any trouble." Camille's eyes narrowed. "Trouble? Because I'm black, and you figured no one would care how you treated me?" Ethan flinched at her words, the reality of the situation hitting him hard. "I didn't think it was going to be a big deal," he muttered. "I didn't think anyone would notice." Matthew's fists tightened on the desk, his knuckles turning white. "And that's the problem, Ethan. You didn't think. You thought you could get away with it. But not here. Not in my restaurant. Ethan's head dropped, and for the first time, he seemed to grasp the full weight of his actions. The excuses were gone, and all that was left was a man who had to face the reality of his prejudice. "We're not done yet," Matthew said, leaning back in his chair. "I want you to come back tomorrow for another meeting. And when you walk in, I expect you to think long and hard about what you've done, because this conversation isn't over." Ethan looked up, his face a mix of shock and fear. "Tomorrow?" "Yes," Matthew said, his voice final. "Go home. Think about your actions. We'll decide your future here tomorrow." Without another word, Ethan stood and left the room, his footsteps slow and heavy. Camille turned to Matthew, her eyes narrowing in thought. "Why tomorrow? Why not just fire him now?" Matthew sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I want him to stew in this for a night. Let it sink in that he's not walking out of here with a slap on the wrist. It'll make it more real. Besides, there's more I want to hear from him tomorrow. He needs to come to terms with what he did, and I need him to admit it fully." Camille nodded slowly. "You're giving him more chances than I would, but I trust you. If he walks in here tomorrow and still doesn't get it," Matthew finished the sentence for her, "he's gone." The next morning, the atmosphere in the office was even tenser than the day before. Camille could feel it in the way the room seemed heavier, more suffocating, as they waited for Ethan to arrive. She glanced at Matthew, who sat behind his desk, his face set in a grim expression. Today, there would be no more chances. Ethan would either face the truth of his actions, or he would be gone. There was a knock at the door, softer this time, almost hesitant. Matthew straightened in his chair, his eyes hardening. "Come in," he called. Ethan entered slowly, his face drawn and pale, the fear from the previous day now etched into his features. His shoulders were slumped, and his usual arrogance had vanished entirely. He walked to the chair across from Matthew and sat down without being asked, his eyes glued to the floor. Matthew let the silence hang for a moment, giving Ethan time to realize just how serious this final meeting was. Camille watched him closely, her frustration still simmering beneath the surface, but she wanted to see if Ethan would finally show any real understanding. "Ethan," Matthew began, his voice cold but calm, "you had a night to think about what happened. So let's hear it. What have you learned?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers twitching as he clasped his hands in his lap. His eyes flicked up to meet Matthew's for a brief second before looking down again. I've been thinking a lot, sir," he stammered, his voice weak, "and I know I made a big mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly last night, and Stop," Camille interrupted, her voice firm and cutting through his half-hearted apology. "This isn't about being careless or making a mistake. You deliberately treated me differently because you thought I wouldn't speak up. You thought you could get away with it. What I want to know is why." Ethan flinched at her words, his face flushing red, his fingers twisted nervously in his lap, and for a moment, it looked like he was going to give another excuse. But then, something shifted in his expression. His shoulders sagged, and he let out a long, shaky breath. "I didn't think anyone would care," he admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought you'd just sit there and take it." Camille leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "And why did you think that? What made you think I wouldn't say anything?" Ethan swallowed hard, the silence in the room growing heavier with every second. He hesitated, glancing between Camille and Matthew, before finally muttering, because you're black." The words hung in the air, raw and exposed. For a moment, no one spoke. Camille's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt a mixture of anger and vindication rising within her. He had finally said it. The truth was out. Matthew's eyes darkened, and he spoke in a low, controlled voice. "So, you thought that because of her race, she wouldn't speak up? That she didn't deserve the same respect as the other diners?" Ethan nodded slowly, his face pale. "I didn't think it was that big of a deal at the time," he admitted, his voice shaky. You thought wrong," Camille said sharply. "You thought you could treat me like I didn't matter, because you assumed no one would hold you accountable. But you were wrong." Ethan's eyes filled with regret, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his head hanging low. "I'm really sorry," he mumbled. "I know it doesn't mean much now, but I really am." Camille sat back in her chair, crossing her arms as she studied him. "You're right," she said, her voice firm. "It doesn't mean much. You knew exactly what you were doing. Apologizing now won't change that." Matthew leaned forward, his expression cold and unreadable. "Do you understand why this can't be forgiven, Ethan?" Ethan nodded slowly, his face a mask of defeat. "Yes, sir, I get it." Matthew stared at him for a long moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "You're fired, Ethan," he said finally, his voice low but resolute. "Pack up your things, and don't come back. This restaurant has no place for people who treat others with disrespect and prejudice. Your actions not only hurt my wife but also damage the reputation of this establishment. Ethan's face crumpled, but he didn't argue. He knew this was the end. Slowly, he rose from the chair, his shoulders hunched, and nodded once more. I understand, sir, he mumbled. I'm really sorry. Apologies won't fix this, Matthew said quietly, his eyes hard. Now go. Without another word, Ethan turned and left the office, the door clicking shut behind him. The silence that followed was heavy, but this time it wasn't filled with tension. It was filled with finality. Camille let out a slow breath, her body relaxing as the weight of the situation lifted off her shoulders. Ethan was gone, and the restaurant was better for it. Matthew leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. I wanted to give him the chance to be honest, he said softly, but I knew he wouldn't make it right. You did the right thing, Camille said, her voice gentle but firm. He needed to go. People like him don't just change overnight. Matthew nodded slowly. I know. And this place, our place, has to stand for more than that. Camille reached across the desk, taking his hand in hers. We did what we needed to do. He squeezed her hand, offering a small smile. We did. The air in the office felt lighter now, and for the first time in days, Camille felt a sense of closure. They had stood up for what was right, and Ethan had faced the consequences of his actions. As they both stood to leave the office, ready to face the day ahead, Camille glanced back at the door where Ethan had exited. She knew there would be more battles like this, more people like him who would try to get away with their prejudices, but she also knew that she and Matthew were ready to fight them. They walked out of the office together, side by side, ready to take on whatever came next. The day after Ethan's firing was quiet, almost too quiet for a place as bustling as Bistro Nouveau. Camille and Matthew stood together in the empty restaurant before the lunch rush began, the soft hum of the kitchen staff preparing for the day as a backdrop. The air felt lighter now, though a trace of the tension from the previous days still lingered. Camille glanced at Matthew as they walked slowly through the dining area, her hand slipping into his. Do you think he's gone for good? She asked, her voice soft but curious. He won't be coming back, Matthew said firmly. I made that clear. Camille nodded, knowing that Ethan's chapter at the restaurant was well and truly closed, but a lingering thought sat at the back of her mind, one she had yet to voice. You know, she began, I kept thinking last night, if Ethan had such a problem with black people, why did he even work for you in the first place? Matthew raised an eyebrow, a small smile pulling at the corner of his lips. I've wondered the same thing. It's funny how people like him think they can hide behind a job, a uniform, and their own twisted logic. But eventually the truth always comes out. Camille sighed, a mixture of frustration and disbelief washing over her. It's so absurd. He's working for a black man, someone who built this place from the ground up, and yet he has the audacity to think he can treat someone like me, like us, as if we don't belong. The hypocrisy is unbelievable. Matthew shook his head, his expression turning serious again. It's the way people like him justify their actions. They think they can compartmentalize their hatred, hide it behind a paycheck or a title. But at the end of the day, it always comes down to fear. Fear of losing power, fear of change, fear of seeing people they don't respect succeed. Camille leaned against one of the polished tables, her fingers tracing the edge of the silverware set out for the day's guests. I still can't believe it. The nerve of someone like that, working in a place built by a black owner, thinking he could look down on me. Matthew smiled softly. He won't be the last, unfortunately. But at least here we've set the standard. People like him won't last in our world. Camille felt a surge of pride as she looked around the restaurant. It was more than just a business. It was a place that stood for something bigger than either of them individually. Matthew had built it from nothing, and together they had made it a success. One that welcomed everyone with respect and dignity, no matter who they were. She straightened up, feeling the weight of the past few days finally lift. You're right, she said quietly. This place isn't just a restaurant. It's a statement. Matthew nodded, his eyes soft as he looked at her. It always has been. They stood in silence for a moment, letting the truth of those words settle between them. The restaurant was more than a business venture or a source of income. It was a space where people of all backgrounds, races, and identities came together, a reflection of the world they wanted to see, and anyone who couldn't respect that didn't belong there. As the staff began to file in, preparing for the lunch crowd, Matthew took Camille's hand and led her toward the back, where they could enjoy a quiet moment before the busy day began. They passed through the kitchen, where the chefs greeted them with warm smiles, and out into the small courtyard behind the building. The sun was warm on Camille's skin, and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the light and the fresh air wash away the remnants of the stress from the past few days. It felt good to breathe, to stand in a place where they both belonged. I'm proud of what we did, she said after a moment, turning to Matthew. We stood up for what was right, and we did it together. Matthew smiled, his hand squeezing hers. Always, they stood there in the quiet of the courtyard, side by side, knowing that while the world outside wasn't perfect, they had carved out a small space that reflected the values they held dear. The restaurant would continue, stronger and more resilient for what had happened. And as they moved forward, they would continue to fight for the respect and dignity of everyone who walked through those doors. No more racists like Ethan. No more silent discrimination. Only people who understood the simple truth. In Bistro Nouveau, everyone belonged.